our presentation is about assessment and language learning. As you remember, the first group talked about choosing assessment activities. We are going to talk about what is the importance of assessment.
How do we choose assessment activities? First of all, we have to know what means assessment. This term means collecting information about learners' performance in order to make judgments about their learning. We can carry out informal assessment or formal assessment. We can identify formal assessment through tests, examinations, and informal assessment. We can identify through normal classroom teaching and learning activities, or some homework tasks. Formal assessment have many purposes. The first one is to assess overall language ability, something called proficiency test. The second one is to assess learning at the end of a course. That is something called achievement test. The third one is to assess learning at the end of a part of a course. That is called process test. And finally, to decide if a learner can continue to the next level. Informal assessment. Here we have three purposes, and the first one is feedback for the teacher. In other words, is to find out how successful our teaching has been. The second one is to help us improve our procedures or choose different materials or activities for future lessons. The third one is feedback for learners about what they can do and what they still need to work on. You have to take account that teachers keeps records of progress but doesn't give grades. That is the first that you have to take in account. Cambridge University implements three types of formal assessment. The first one is called starters. The second one is movers, and finally we have flyers.
The following are some examples of starters, movers, and flyer listening tests. The aims of the test are: sample relevant and meaningful language use, measure accurately and fairly, present a positive first impression of the international tests, promote effective learning and teaching, encourage future learning and teaching.
Now we are going to talk about the issues in assessing children's language learning. There are many factors that should be taken into account when we want to evaluate our students' learning process. Those factors can be, for example, the age, the content of the language learning, the teaching methods, the learning theories, and the aims.
The age is about the children's motor, linguistic, social, and conceptual development that must be taken into account in designing and implementing the assessment. In content of language learning, we make focus on the oral skills, vocabulary development, and language use at discourse level. Methods of teaching are tools that teachers use like games, songs, rhymes, stories, all with the purpose to carry language content and practice. The learning theories, for example, talks about the zone of the proximal development, learning through social interactions, able to do more with helpful other. The aims are programs for young learners that often cite social and cross-cultural aims, as well as language learning objectives. That's why the aims of assessment should be built in order to solve social and cultural needs. Assessment practices are under political, commercial, and cultural pressure. Why? Because nowadays teachers seem to be forced to teach what is going to be assessed. For instance, many projects about how improve testing activities were reduced to paper and pencil tests, without taking into account the individual needs from each student. which is a critical point because testing practices with the syllabus determine what children will learn and how will be their experiences in lessons. Also, parents saw testing as a pass or fail process, rather than a way to reinforce what the students have learned. Another fact is that the examination syndicate produces a list of words and topics that will be tested, making it more difficult for teachers to teach topics or vocabulary that are not on that list, because they may reduce their pupils' chances of success in the test.
The next topic is Principle for Assessing Children Language Learning. This topic is about language learning as a center of assessment process. As Vygotsky said, learning occurs in a social context and through interactions with helpful adults or other children. That is the proposal of assessment.
Principles for assessing children language learning. Learning and assessment have to work together. That means that we have to emphasize children's willingness to participate in social interactions with the Vygotskian perspective. This part is very important because it explains us how assessment should support learning and teaching. Assessment should contribute to the learning process for an individual child or for the class. Teachers have to understand language learning processes and their social context. Assessment asks how our students are growing. That means that helps us to determine how is their learning process. Assessment have positive effects. The process and outcomes of assessment can motivate the learners. An assessment activity can provide a helpful model of language use. An assessment activity and feedback from it can support further learning. The outcomes of assessment can help teachers plan more effective lessons. What do you think about assessment activities? Assessment is more than a testing. You have to think that you, as a future teacher, you have to think that it's not necessary to test children to understand how much they have learned, or at least it is not necessary to do if too often. There are other ways to assess language learning that go beyond testing. Other alternative assessment include observations, portfolios, and self-assessment. Other important thing is that assessment should be congruent with learning. Congruent means that assessment should fit comfortably with children's learning experience and use common assessment activities for children. In your teaching process, you have to take into account that children and parents should understand assessment issue. It's very important because all the changes that teachers will do in the new assessment practice will know by children and their parents.
Now, with the key concepts in assessments, we're going to check the different resources that we can use to determine the student learning process. Also, we're going to know how we can use that resources in order to determine how the students are learning, and how can we create assessments depending on each class that we're going to manage.
Right now we're going to talk about the different resources that I already told you that we can use in order to determine the student learning process. The first one is the assessment, that is how we qualify that process. Then the evaluation, that is in a bigger level, and it's how we evaluate the entire class. So in order to do that, we need to take different points of view. We need to take in account the course recommendations, observation of the class, feedbacks, etc. And the testing, that is a particular form of assessment that is concerned with measuring learning through the performance. And now we have the summative assessment, that is the one that we're going to use at the end of the learning process to determine the knowledge that the students acquire. On this kind of assessment, we are not going to get any kind of feedback, because on the next unit they're going to learn different things. The knowledge that they are going to manage is different from this one. Now we're going to talk about the achievement and diagnostic assessments. The achievement assessment is the one that we use to know what the student can do, and the diagnostic assessment is the one that we use to know to determine the different problems that the students may have with that specific topic in order for us to change the methodology. When we want to use a specific assessment, first we need to check the validity that it has. What I mean is that first we need to know if that assessment is going to help us to get the feedback what we expect to do. When we talk about the fairness, is when we said that it's necessary to provide children the ways that they can show what they can do. They need to create the self-confidence necessary to get better every day. When we talk about planning and designing an assessment, we need to take in account that the information that we're going to use is not going to complicate the student's performance. On the planning of the assessment, we need to take in account 6 different points of view that we need to use in order to make a good assessment. The first one is purpose and objectives of the assessment. On this one, we can use questions as how does this relate to the learning experience of the children, or what do I want to use the assessment outcomes for? The second one is methods of assessment. On this one, there are questions as how will the information that is collected be interpreted, or how will the students be involved in gathering the information. The third one is quality management in assessment. On this one, there are questions as how can I make sure that the assessment is valid, or how can I make sure the assessment is fair. The fourth one is the feedback. On this one, we can use questions as how will I communicate the outcomes of the assessment, or who will I share the assessment outcomes with. The fifth one is the uses of assessment. How will the outcomes of assessment inform future teaching, planning, and learning opportunities. And the last one, the sixth one, is the impact of the assessment. On this one, the questions are how will the impact be on the student's motivation.
You may open the envelopes containing your papers. The exam starts now.
Now we are going to talk about the uses of the assessment information. This information that the different assessment provide us, we can use it in order to improve the activities that we want to use with the students, and also we can provide them the different tools so they can improve their own learning process.
Outcomes of assessment and uses. The summative assessment techniques, such as tests, produce outcomes in the form of grades and ranking of the students, but little more quality information that can be used diagnostically. Summative outcomes can be used to evaluate the effectiveness of a course or program, along with the other information such as students and teachers' evaluations. When we talk about ranking the students, it's because we want to take the best choice about the school, class, or group that the students is going to be placed in, making feedback helpful to learners. This feedback that we get at the moment of place the assessment is not just to improve our methodologies and activities, also is to help the student to improve themselves so they can get a better knowledge and grow up as good citizens. One example that we can say about using the feedback in order to improve the student's knowledge is when the student is learning the past simple. Sometimes the student is going to confuse the past simple with the present simple, and he can say things like, I come to school at 8 o'clock. At that moment, the teacher is going to correct the students, saying that the correct way to say that sentence is, I came to school at 8 o'clock. So students are going to repeat that, they're going to prove their knowledge, and we are going to get feedback. Message from assessment. We can use the assessment's feedback not just to know the children's future, but also to let the parents to know how good are their children and how can they help to improve their children's knowledge.
Finally, we have the messages from the assessment. Assessment determines more than children's future and how they spend their time. Assessment is an important tool to provide feedback of what the students do. Also, the assessment helps teachers to express what are their expectations, and that's the way how teachers, through the assessment, practice and reinforce the 4 skills of the students and help them to develop their communicative competence.